Undeniably, the world remains plagued by crisis and a host of enduring injustices owed to colonial power and domination.
In turn, countless revolutionary thinkers from times past and present have identified modernity as a point source of oppression.
When taking stock of the violent ways in which modernity was and continues to be forged, the Caribbean has been ground zero. That is the crucible of modernity.
As an intervention that centers the Caribbean, this season of Surviving Society will provide a window into several of the region's grassroots struggles for land, life, and liberation. Today we're joined by Dr. Tessa Berry, a local researcher based in Grenada. Tessa, earlier we were discussing aspects of the New Jewel movement as well as the revolutionary government in Grenada, as well as then too taking a look at some of the research that you've been up to in Grenada as well as around the rest of the Caribbean. So in terms of the shape of this episode, as well as the substance, I was thinking that maybe a conversation about the New Jewel movement, as well as then to the research that you're conducting, as well as directing in Grenada and beyond, might make for a compelling conversation. And while this series is very much taking a critical perspective and standpoint on modernity, I think myself, as well as co-producers Johannah and Adaeze, are very much interested in hearing about what modernity has produced in the Caribbean, both historically, as well as in the contemporary moment, but then also the ways in which different groups, as well as communities across the Caribbean, have asserted their political agency, have responded to colonial modernity, as well as then attempted to breathe life into a variety of different alternatives, some of which are based in revolutionary politics. Taking those things into consideration, if you can tell us a bit about the revolutionary government, as well as some of the programs, some of the policies, as well as then too about their politics in general, with respect to why the revolutionary government in Grenada emerged, what ended up eventually happening to the revolutionary government, as well as then too, what were some of the gains that emerged from the revolutionary government?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I would speak mainly from little knowledge, I should say, reading New Jewel movement and having an interest in that particular movement at the time, given my background, my family background relative to the New Jewel movement. In earlier times, let's say from around the 50s, there, Grenada's first prime minister then, that was prior to our independence, was Sir Eric Matthew Gary. And he came into the fray at a pretty young age, as one of those, radical leaders in the days of the colonial Caribbean. So he was Dutch origin, but would have been a Grenadian citizen from early age. So in the 50s, then he became our leader at the time. And at that point in time, his leadership style was questioned by many. He was considered to have a sort of tyrannic approach. For example, his approach to land, his approach to, when I say his approach to land, basically in the acquisition of land from persons, from individuals, etc. And he was basically believed to be a leader that was sort of tyrannic in his approach. He was very instrumental in terms of trade unionism and formed the Grenada United Labour Party in the 1950s. That's Sir Eric Matthew Gary I'm speaking to here. And then in the early 1950s, we had this election where his GLP won 6 of the 8 seats at the time during that government. His rule spanned right up until he was ousted with the New Jewel movement. Now, the New Jewel movement gained its rise during that period when that's during the 1960s, I would say, when at that time, you would say there were a number of different unrest taking place in the region, in the Caribbean region. You talk about some of the unrest experience in places like Jamaica, in places like Trinidad, like in the 70s, etc., Dominica, etc. And Grenada and the New Jewel movement was formed at around that time, beginning with some like-minded individuals, persons like, of varied background. Some of them background in economics, some of them with background in agriculture, some of them with background in education, etc. So you'd have a few of these persons, names like Unison Whiteman, names like, Morris Bishop, the famous Morris Bishop. These guys came together and formed the new Jewel movement. That's in terms of my recollection back back then, and what I would have read and in discussion with my parents, etc. So by the early 1970s, power in Grenada was in the hands of the then ruler, Sir Eric Matthew Gary. So Matthew Gary had a lot of let's say support from the rural community, because he was very instrumental in assisting the working class. So he's known for the idea of trade unionism, etc. But with the new Jewel movement coming on stream, based on the displeasure with his type of leadership, the new Jewel movement formed and attempted to, well, I shouldn't say attempted, successfully formed the revolutionary movement. And in 1979, I was pretty small at the time, very young, and not so much of an understanding of what it meant then and what revolution meant then. Because 1979, I was probably around 4 years, 5 years old at the time. I was 4 years actually at the time. And the New Jewel movement, in their bid to confront the government of Sir Eric Matthew Gary, we saw them engage in that sort of alliance with the People's Revolutionary Movement, etc., and sort of took leadership, of the country at the time. That's after experiencing a lot of the New Jewel movement and their organization experiencing a lot of atrocities under the then Sir Eric Matthew Gary's government, because at the time, many of them, they were considered as sort of opposition force. And we had back then under Sir Eric Matthew Gary what was referred to as the Mongoose Gang. I don't know if you ever heard about that group that was referenced as the Mongoose Gang, that probably not the formation wasn't intended to be persons who spoke out against the Sir Eric Matthew Gary, who was in opposition of his leadership. The intent was not, the intent of the formation of that gang was not for that, keeping those persons silent. However, it was recognized as that later on in its formation. And you have instances where the leadership of the New Jewel movement was beaten, was tortured, some of them imprisoned by what was then referred to as the Mongoose Gang. The revolution against Sir Eric Matthew Gary took on that approach to get rid of him. So the period between, let's say, independence, Grenada gained independence in 1974 and under the leadership of Sir Eric Matthew Gary. So in Grenada, and as a matter of fact, we're soon to be celebrating our 49th year of independence, which should be on the 7th of February this year. And between the period of February 74 and 79, you had that rulership under Gary, where you had the experience emerging that would have inevitably led to that decision to gain control of the Sir Eric Matthew Gary's government at the time. So we're talking about 1979, where the New Jewel movement, in what was then referred to as a revolutionary movement, took over the leadership of Grenada.
Do you know what was the significance of the mongoose? Like why they called it the mongoose gang?
Yes, actually, recently, I may have to do a little bit more research on that, but in my work now, in speaking to some persons from that era, the Grenada has an animal that we refer to as mongoose that is usually in the wild, and these animals, they sort of like rodent-looking type animal. They are very destructive to farmlands, farm animals, etc. So that gang was organized basically to go out, and in those days they would have traps set to catch the mongoose and destroy them. That was how they were destroyed back in the day, because we had a lot of these type of animals roaming the agricultural lands, destroying crops, destroying animals, and that some farmers would lose their livestock because of the mongoose. And then it was also a danger to humans in the sense that it carried a disease that was referred to as rabies. And even if bitten, then it could be, sort of detrimental to human life. So this gang, I understand, was formed to sort of trap these animals and get rid of them during that period when they were very prevalent in Grenada. So as I alluded to earlier on, the intent moved towards probably silencing members who opposed to this Eric Matthew government at the time.
Thanks for that, Tessa. It's a wonderful and comprehensive genealogy of the Grenadian Revolution, as well as then, too, mentioning these aspects of the historical trajectory of the movement, as well as Grenada, in which Gary had a history with trade union movements, but then once upon gaining power, became seemingly an authoritarian tyrant, as well as had a private militia, if not hit squad, to silence critics, as well as the opposition. And then, as you're mentioning, the masses weren't down with that, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so then emerges the revolutionary government. And once they seize power or take control of the country, myself, as well as both Johanna and Adaeze, were reviewing a document, the title of which I find quite amazing. And it's a report, if not book, that was released by the revolutionary government called Is Freedom We Makin'? And in that, the table of contents details some of the things that were taking place during the revolution, as well as some of the efforts and programs that they were instituting and implementing. And one of the chapters is referred to as Women Step Forward. There's another one that is, I think, dripping with militant irony that says revolutionary democracy, not Westminster hypocrisy. And so in thinking about this project of the revolutionary government, of making freedom, of breathing life into democratic alternatives, as well as into some of the specific things they were doing with respect to women's programs, as well as then even to agriculture, health initiatives, education, outreach programs, these sorts of things. It seems like it was very much a part of the mandate of the revolutionary government and New Jewel movement to focus on these things. Hence the name Joint Endeavor on Welfare, Education, and Liberation. So I'm wondering, and I think you were selling yourself short earlier when you said you had a very small understanding or maybe knowledge of what happened. So I would say don't be modest about what you know about the movement. But I'm wondering maybe if you could tell us a bit more about some of the programs of the revolutionary government, as well as some of the gains that it made in Grenada.
Just to go back a little to what you mentioned there, you mentioned the word Westminster, and before I answer that question, one of the objectives of the revolution the political objectives. Grenada inherited the Westminster type parliamentary system. And one of the objectives of the revolutionary movement, the New Jewel movement, was to sort of stay away Grenada from that type of system and replace it, because replace it with a different type of political system. The New Jewel movement believed that we needed to move away from the Westminster system. Now going back to your question, in light of some of the objectives, like relative to better health care, relative to better education, relative to empowerment of women, relative to better housing conditions, because those are some of the things that the movement believed that Grenadians needed at that time. So we would see that in the 4 years of the revolution, they actually dedicated each year to some sort of cause. So in 1979, if I would go back to just my father had this small book that referenced the achievements of the revolution. They basically at the end of each year documented what they referred to as the achievement based on the objectives per year. So in the year 1979 was referred to as the year of liberation or the year of freedom of the people. 1980 was referred to as the year of education and production. And I'm mentioning this just to go back a little bit on some of the programs and projects that were undertaken by the revolution. You would see that based on how they dedicated the years, that some of the programs and projects were directed towards achieving the objectives as to the year of dedication. In 1981, it was the year of agriculture and industries. 1982, the year of economic construction. 1983, the year of political and academic education. And 1984, the year of the International Airport. And as you would realize, the year of the International Airport, because the revolution came to its demise in 1983. So the year of the International Airport actually started, but wasn't completed because the revolution was cut short within a 4-year period. So going back to some of these programs and projects. So there was this movement towards education. So we had a lot of programs relating to adult literacy programs. Those programs were highly community-based programs. So you would find that within a lot of the community centers around Grenada, that we had a number of programs, educational programs dedicated to assisting the adult population, because in those days we had what was then referred to as a sort of high level of illiteracy in terms of literature, in terms of reading, etc. So that was a national program, adult literacy program, given the idea of the year of education. And that was basically to ensure that as much persons were literate in terms of the educational achievement. So there were a number of programs put on within the communities, etc. So the year of education and production. And one of the things that I admired, what I would like to say here, Dr. Levi, is that I think for me, the revolution was during my formative years. So it meant a lot to me in terms of shaping who I am today. So the year of education, I saw how important at a young age, the level of relevance and importance emphasized by the revolution as for members of communities to be empowered through the process of education. So we saw a lot of programs taking place in various areas like nutrition, craft, politics. There was that level of country and patriotism. All of these were educational opportunities. We had something called the community educational programs where CPE. I can't quite recall now what CPE means. That's something I probably can look up, but that was a national education program that a lot of persons got involved in to improve themselves. And then you had the year of agriculture and agro industries. And during that period, we saw the rise of agriculture in Grenada, where we became quite self-sufficient in production. So you saw an increase in production in various crops. And not just the increase in the production, but what was done with the produce, because we saw a number of industries, agro industries like jams and jellies. And those were not just cottage industries, where because that came in also during the period where a number of housewives, etc., were trained in cottagery, in making of things using our local produce like jams and jellies. And one that was used significantly would be our nutmeg jams and nutmeg jellies made from the nutmeg pods of our famous nutmeg spice. We also had juices and nectars. So I remember growing up on tamarind nectar, and tamarind is a fruit that you can find here in Grenada. Mango nectar, those were things that we saw being produced, factories and agro processing industries where our local produce was utilized to create drinks and to things that we could use locally and didn't have to import. Even in the fishery sector, we saw development there. And I remember there was one time when we had our own codfish factory. Unfortunately, no, we do not have that again, where what we refer to locally as salted fish. We made that here. I remember as a youth, as a child growing up, our in school we all had to visit these factories, see the makings of these factories. And I know, and one of the things I want to point out here that I remember, and I'm going from apart from the historical aspect of it that is in the literature. I'm also speaking from my own memory, where a number of bakeries, you had a number of housewives who were encouraged to step out of the kitchen and not bake only for their families, but bake for the community. So you had a number of community bakeries established during that period where you would purchase from individuals in from the bakeries in those communities. So the year of agriculture and agro processing, we saw the rise of production, agricultural production. We saw the rise of agro processing industries, etc. And then one of the things I would also mention here that the schools were very much involved in these in the aspect of agriculture, because we saw a number of school gardening approaches. So the children, young persons were involved to get involved in gardening in the schools and so. And then you had the year of economic construction and the year of political and academic education. And that was 1982, 1983, economic construction and political and academic education. So there we saw that there was this trust that of patriotism that was instilled and embedded within the people, and Grenadians became that love of country. I think developed during that period. And you know, one of the things that I can recall was the use of billboards, etc., across the country. So wherever you travel in Grenada, you would see billboards about education, billboards about agriculture, and I'm speaking about huge billboards, established across the country. So wherever you went, these things were protracted to us as citizens. So even if you didn't want to, you were confronted with aspects of agriculture, aspects of education, etc. And another thing I think emanated was the idea of community development and the idea of community spirit. So a lot of community groups and organizations were established during the revolutionary period also. And these groups were all at community building. So we found that during the period, the revolutionary period, there were a lot of groups established, even for cleaning of communities that was undertaken by the people, so people got a sense of pride in their surroundings, in the environment. A lot of cultural activities, cultural groups, etc., were established in communities. You would find community exhibitions of what we call homemakers organization, where persons within the community, especially the women, because another thing that was very important during the revolution was that of the empowerment of women to establish their own opportunities for generating revenue through the homemakers organizations within the community. As a matter of fact, the community where I came from had a very thriving homemakers club or homemakers organization. They would meet on a weekly basis where the women were taught to make things that would help them to be able to establish their own small cottage industry or their own small businesses emanating from their kitchens, emanating from their homes, etc. So those are some of the things that, in my reading and also from my own recollection.
I loved hearing about your own personal reflection because that was actually one of the questions, that I had. Like, what did the political movement mean to you, as a Grenadian? So I really gained, a lot from your reflection, even talking about the way that the landscape changed, as well as the, community in terms of how they did things. And I guess a different ethos or like approach to development. So thank you so much for that. And it invokes a bunch of questions, but I have to go one at a time. And I'll start with asking you to talk more about women's involvement, specifically in the political party and the political process during that revolutionary period.
You would have heard of Jacqueline Creft. So she was very instrumental, as she was actually part of the movement, and she was instrumental in the thrust towards women's education and women's involvement. But what I would like to say here, though, is that not just from the revolutionary group itself, the New Jewel movement itself, but a number of women across Grenada were given opportunities to serve on council. So one of the things that were established during the period of the revolution was village councils and so. And women were given the opportunity to serve on these councils in leadership position within the communities, to help establish and grow their communities, because women were believed to be very instrumental in building, in building communities, in building families, etc. And so they were given opportunities to exercise leadership through education. So just as how we had some given opportunities to go and study, because remember they would have formed an alliance with Cuba, and one of the things Cuba gave during that period was number of scholarship opportunities for education, etc. So we have persons like Jacqueline Creft, and in my community, there was this lady called Miss Luvi Ventu. She's a well-known community activists. We had persons like Miss Cotilda. Those were women that rose during the revolutionary period with not just their radicalism, but their approach to development and to educating the masses. So these women led not just re-education, but also re-agro-processing, agricultural development, re-community, cultural groups and organizations, etc. These women led in many of these. There probably are a number of names that I can't remember, I can't recall now, but even in the health sector, there are persons like Miss Ann Peters, and she would have told her story in terms of the development of the health sector during that period. So we have a number of women heavily involved, even in as it relates to the military organizations. Women were encouraged to get involved in the militia, in the PRG. So they too were also involved from an army perspective.
Thank you so much for that. Because I mean, often in learning about feminism and women's rights, we know that there are, even the names of women that we know, there are probably so many more that didn't get recorded, that weren't talked about, that whose names that we don't have to remember at this point, even though the contribution would have been so vast. So thank you so much for adding some names to the list in terms of women that were part of the struggle and in doing the daily work of revolution.
Yeah, something, Johanna, that I think, whereas we might see many of the names, like some of the names like Jacqueline Preference, so who were involved politically, I think the stories of many of the women probably might have not been told, like some of them who were heavily involved during the revolutionary period. Because for my mother, for example, was quite involved. My first sister, was a part of the army, and their stories haven't been told. So, there are a number of women from the community perspective, I think, that would have a lot of stories to tell. And I hope that, in our research work going forward, that I can harness the voices of some of these women.
Important and necessary work that you're engaging in, Dr. Tessa. It also strikes me that the New Jewel movement, in a lot of different ways, we're making contributions to things that you'll hear across the globe, as well as within the academy, about a variety of different efforts that are being made to create a better world. For example, you were talking about the way in which political education became a mandate and program of the New Jewel movement, with respect to even, I don't know if they use this terminology, but it seems like they were very directly decolonizing the curriculum, as well as then too, you had mentioned the ways in which they were wanting to depart from the Westminster system and breathe life into a different, more radical, maybe participatory form of direct democracy. You had also mentioned, too, the focus on the agricultural sector and self-sufficiency. And whilst they may not have been using the term food sovereignty, it very much seems like they were making efforts to advance what La Via Campesina later termed in the 90s as food sovereignty. And so in many ways, it seems like they were on the cutting edge of a lot of different forms of revolutionary praxis. And then, too, the way in which you're signaling the importance of rank and file members of any revolutionary movement, folks at the grassroots molecular level that are participating in co-creating a new revolutionary landscape, as well as different possibilities, and the ways in which they're not necessarily mentioned or written out of the historiography of any given context, country, or even movement. Also reference memory, as well as then too the ways in which this political movement was deeply personal to you, as well as then too stories of women and stories of people at the grassroots level. Before we dive more deeply into those, as well as their significance, In talking about the New Jewel movement, you had also mentioned the way that it was cut short or its untimely demise. And so I'm wondering if maybe very briefly you can mention and tell us a bit about what ended up happening to the New Jewel movement, as well as why, unfortunately, I would argue regrettably, is it no longer existing in Grenada today. So a bit about the way in which the New Jewel movement and revolutionary government was cut short.
Right. So when you mention about the revolution and the whole idea of its whole liberation idea and the idea of freedom and the idea of nationalism, etc. I recall one of the quotes from Maurice Bishop was that the right and freedom of expression is only relevant if people are not hungry or too tired to be able to express themselves. And that was one of Maurice Bishop's quotes, in one of his speech where he was speaking about human rights and democracy. And the idea, this resonates in agriculture, because it says that we needed to feed ourselves, to be able to feed ourselves so that we would have freedom of expression, not be too dependent. Because when it is believed that when you're dependent on another system or another society, you're not able to be as free with your expressions. And so the idea of the relevance of ensuring that there's food sovereignty is to be able to give an opportunity to be free with expressions. So going back to the question now in terms of the New Jewel movement, there's this struggle with between factors or members of the New Jewel movement. And historically, you would hear about Maurice Bishop and Bernard Coard and the discord that may have manifested itself within the party. And that basically led to the demise of the revolution, in the sense there were concerns relative to the different ideologies, concerns relative to, the varying differences in terms of the whole outlook on what is democratic socialism, these sort of things. And so you saw what happened, that within the party itself, there was this code taking place, separation of ideas, difference in belief, difference in leadership style, the idea of collective leadership, etc. All of these things were issues that probably would have led, to, the differences in between or among members. So you would have one group of people that supported what we say would have been the Maurice Bishop school of thought, and another supporting that, or would have led by that of Bernard Coard and his group. And so what we saw from back then was Bernard Coard's faction more or less overtaking or taking over the Maurice Bishop faction. And so we had Bishop and a number of his cabinet members being executed during the revolutionary period, so the year 1983. And given that one of the mantra of the revolution was that of people and development, there was a love that exuded from the people of Grenada. Mind you, the revolution is not without its negatives, because you would have a lot of persons in Grenada that can give you a different story, that would tell you that if you speak to them today, they would talk about the aspects of the revolution that were negative, and that some people believe that they experienced, from some persons were jailed. They believe that probably the revolution diverted from its intent of democracy. You have some persons with that school of thought, and they too believe that when they attempted to voice their opinion or to say anything against revolution, some of them would give you their stories of being jailed, etc. Actually, one of my favorite farmers, he was he was imprisoned. Of our own former Prime Minister Tillman Thomas was also imprisoned during the revolution. So these persons, you would find that they also have issues with the revolution. So it wasn't just within the New Jewel movement itself that there were moments of differences. You also had persons within the country who weren't pleased with the way things were going and some of the things that they believed were not right during the revolutionary period. You had Ronald Code and his faction then taking over, and we saw the demise of Maurice Bishop and some of his cabinet members. And is the execution style in which they came to the end, you know. And one of the things during that period, I remember as a child that we were wondering what was going on, because in that at that time we didn't understand that it was, that what we didn't understand what was taking place as children when we saw loads of school children heading towards our town area, like this the St. George's area. And in listening to what was happening that time, you heard that they were going to free Maurice Bishop because him and some of his cabinet members were placed under house arrest by the other faction within the New Jewel movement. So what I could say there is that the within the movement itself, the differences in terms of what the objectives are, the differences in terms of their ideologies, etc., led to, the demise, I believe, of the revolution and the unfortunate end of Maurice Bishop.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Tessa. And then it seems like it's still a deeply sensitive issue and topic of conversation in Grenada to this day.
It is, and there is a lot of persons who are still carrying hurt, because even today, the history of the revolution is not taught in schools. What you hear about the revolution is what some of us would get from persons who would have written snippets of it, and we because of our interest, we would read. But I didn't learn about the revolution in school. I learned about the revolution because my parents were part of the New Jewel movement. My father was an army major, so I learned from him aspects of the revolution. And of course, he would have only divulged what then would be referenced as the positive aspects of the revolution, because he was part of the Maurice Bishop faction. So what we learn as young persons growing up is what we hear from persons from the community, what we see in our own formative years during the revolutionary period, and those aspects that are written. But it is not a history that is taught in school. There are still lots of raw emotions from persons who believe that they were wronged by the revolution. And so if you go around asking questions, even that too, you may have to be careful, because some people still don't even want to speak about aspects of the revolution. So it's still something that is very raw in the Grenadian psyche. And I must say that too is that a number of young persons, like persons younger than I am, they are growing up without much of a knowledge of what took place. And this is why I'm so passionate about the work that we set out to do, in terms of, even if it's our aspect of it is agricultural related, I do believe that it's important to archive and document, so that persons younger than I am, and our children and grandchildren would have that knowledge going forward, documented, and probably later on they may be the ones to say that we need to teach the history of the revolution in schools.
So amazing. And oftentimes people downplay the importance of like register and writing things down and writing stories down. But you would see the importance when you observe the way that the revolution is commemorated sometimes. Because depending on who's organizing what events, it might happen in March. And then for some, it might happen later in the year to commemorate the invasion that would have taken place
Taking place,
after.
yes, a week after. Yeah.
Right.
And
So
Johanna,
yeah.
as you mentioned that, in recent times, there was this discussion here taking place right here in Greenidge because on October 25th every year, we celebrate Thanksgiving Day. And that is marked as the day when, quote unquote, with the US invasion, when they came in and we were liberated from, the demise of the revolution at the time. So we celebrate the US invasion basically. We celebrate when they came in on October 25th. Um, but there are many persons with the school of thought that wish the holiday should be October 19th, which is when Maurice Bishop and members of his cabinet was killed. And persons, there are many Grenadians who believe that this is when the public holiday should be and not on the 25th because they ascribe more relevance to us observing and as a people the loss of those lives that were very instrumental in taking Grenada forward, as opposed to the invasion. And then those who you have that sort of separation with those who believe that we should celebrate the holiday on the 19th, and those who believe that we should celebrate it on the 25th, and that's October itself. And then going back to what you just alluded to in terms of March 30th, 1979,
Yeah.
if that's when we should have, that holiday because it saw the onset of a new movement, a new regime taking over at the time.
I mean, like you, I didn't learn about the revolution in, let's say, primary school or secondary school, which is when I think we should talk about a lot of the Caribbean revolutionary movements that would have taken place in our history. But I learned about it in UE when I was, doing my degree. But it wasn't in class. I
It
was
was
part
the
of the student
Grenadian
socialist.
students. Yes,
Yeah, they partnered with the SSC and then they held
yes,
Maurice Bishop lectures. There were 4 lectures that, took place and it would always happen in March.
yes.
Um, so I mean, I know that that's, super important to have, those conversations. And I think especially the New Jewel movement, because it was so successful, even though, it was cut short. Um,
Yes,
and I guess I want to ask, because the student in me, the activist in me, the socialist, whatever in me, kind of wants to know, based on your, lived experience and engagement with the revolution, especially, your experiences during the untimely end of it, like what message would you give, to younger people, activists, people who are into change with based on that period of time that forms part of your life. Like what do you have to tell us? Based on your reflections, your personal reflections of that period.
well, I think there's a lot. What I can say is that there's a lot to learn from what happened during the revolutionary period, and there's a lot of takeaway for us as young people. In the sense that the importance of community activism, the importance of education, the importance of country, and the importance of people. And I think as young people, this is something that I believe is what can shape us, whether it be academically. So if you look at the revolution, you would see how it emphasized empowerment in so many different ways. It emphasized academic empowerment. So it showed the relevance of having an education. It emphasized the empowerment as in terms of patriotism and love of country, love for country. So as a young person, you can take away that also, that lesson that came from it is what you can do for your country. Then how can you as an individual contribute to building a country and building the people of a country. You take away that from the revolution. You take away the idea of individualism as well as teamwork. And when I say teamwork, I mean coming together of not just family but community to grow, and that you don't grow just as an individual, but you also grow as a country. Whereas, whilst at the same time maintaining your individualism. So those things I think is relevant to take away. And another thing I think that comes from it is the importance of, as Dr. Levi would have alluded to earlier on, the importance of being able to be self-sufficient, being able to be independent, not just as an individual, but as a country, So those are things that I think we can take away, the empowerment of women, getting their voices be heard, young women in terms of leadership positions. Leadership is also something that I think came about as a key aspect of the revolution, because as young people, we were trained to be leaders from an early age. We were given leadership roles in community groups and community organizations as youths. So from me, for example, from as early as the age of 6, 7, I was given an opportunity to read in front of community persons in community organizations. There was this organization referred to as the Pioneers. The Pioneers were a group of young people brought together in different communities, to learn about country, to learn about patriotism, to learn about the political discourse, to understand how we can contribute as youths to development. So from a very young age, I grasped the concept of leadership and given opportunity at a young age to be a leader. And that emanated for me during that period. We were allowed to, in national rallies, and so as young people, we were allowed to go up on a platform and speak, whether it be through poetry, whether it be through dance. We were allowed to be on platforms at very young age. And so for me, those are some of the lessons I think: leadership, empowerment through education, empowerment through community activism and community development, love of country, patriotism, etc.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I definitely appreciate those messages, and I know our listeners will as well. Levi, over to you.
Okay, Dr. Tessa, I'm thoroughly convinced that if a time machine existed, I would sprint to it and go back to 1979 and try to do whatever I could to contribute to what you've lined out with respect to the horizon that the New Jewel movement was pursuing in terms of, and I think you mentioned several different things there that are quite significant. They're oftentimes maybe not necessarily mentioned when discussing revolutionary movements, in that it seemed like a sense of self-efficacy and the degree to which creative expression was important in the revolutionary government, as well as then to the movement, whilst agricultural self-sufficiency, political education programs, women's empowerment groups, rural health initiatives were also being implemented by the revolutionary government. So it's a very inspiring overview of the movement that you've provided. And then too, you also mentioned earlier the way in which it's significant to document and archive what took place during the New Jewel movement and the revolutionary government, which leads me to my next question, and it relates to some of the work you're doing on the ground. And so I'm familiar with much, if not all, of your writing, as well as the research and interventions you've made into critiquing and offering solutions to challenges in the Grenadian, if not Caribbean, food system, as well as into some of the more specific community outreach that you're doing in terms of interviewing people who were maybe a part of the revolutionary government or who were at least also around during it, or maybe even a part of the program. So I'm wondering, could you tell us a bit about some of that? What does that work look like when you're interviewing people about the political history of Grenada, as well as then two, you're also engaging with farmers, rural land workers in remote and rural areas, as well as then two, even just working class folks in urban areas about attempts being made to bring about economic justice in Grenada, as well as a more sustainable and just food system. So could you speak a little bit about one, just the research projects and initiatives and processes that you're engaging in, one regarding the New Jewel movement and revolutionary government, and then two, the work that you're doing on the food system, as well as then two, maybe some of the challenges that are emerging and that you're hoping to sort of see rectified with respect to food systems and the agricultural sector in Grenada as well as the Caribbean.
Right. So one of the lessons learned from the whole aspect of the revolutionary was that it is possible as a small island developing state to produce adequately. I mean, we wouldn't be totally free of aspects of importation, but as it stands now, we're quite we're net importers of food. And what came out from the revolution is that we don't have to be net importers of food. Yes, we can import food, but we don't have to be net importers, because during the revolutionary period, we had such increases in agricultural production and also agro processing. So the evidence is there. And in going about in the research, whilst many may have aspects of the revolution that they might be displeased with, this is one general consensus, both by those who were for or against the revolution, that agriculture was something that thrived during that period because emphasis was placed on it. And one of the things I would lend air to here is that in my discussion with both persons from who were politically involved with the New Jewel movement, as well as those who were on the recipient end, that the policies that were put in place to support agricultural development was very instrumental in how agriculture grew during the revolution, because it was not just about developing agriculture, but putting the supportive structures in place to develop agriculture by way of, not by way of education, by way of financing, by way of policy, by way of capacity development, by way of farmer groups and organizations, collectivism, etc. So these things, cooperatives, all of these things were there, and people still revere that aspect of the revolution. Despite some may have issues with the revolution, they recognize that aspect is there. So going about in my work, interviewing and speaking to persons where they highlight what we are experiencing now in terms of food insecurity and the vulnerability of us as a region, not just Grenada, but as the Caribbean region, given as small island developing states. We are vulnerable to external shocks. For example, the Russia-Ukraine war. We are vulnerable to climate change and the climatic changes in conditions, So because of that, and these have significant impact on food security, especially because we are net importers. So what I find is that when I go around asking questions, interviewing people bring me back a lot to the revolution and saying, we can go back there, that's not in terms of time, but in terms of the approaches that were used, the best practices. And these are things that we can take lessons from that can help us now to counteract what we are experiencing now in terms of the impact on our food sovereignty, the impact on food security, So for example, if we import less, if we concentrate more on production, and in terms of the value addition of what we produce, and put the proper structures and so in place for that, then we would not be so impacted by external shocks. for example, the global pandemic that sort of immobilized in terms a lot of persons in terms of the air bridge and the sea bridge, because we are net importers of food, we were gravely impacted. We were impacted by, foods coming in and so. And also, when you have wars, as we see now in Russia, Ukraine, that impact we have on it has on the importation of the types of fertilizer, our dependence on wheat, when we have foods here that can substitute for wheat, you know, of and going back to the whole idea of the revolution and its emphasis on education and emphasis on localization, allowing the people to have that pride in what is produced locally and what is used locally, something that came out from the revolution that I think comes out a lot in my interaction with persons on the ground. That if we as a people, it's all well and good to ask farmers to produce. It's all well and good to ask the government to put the proper policies and structures in place to ensure agricultural development, to ensure betterment in terms of food sovereignty. But if we as a people are not educated enough as it regards to our consumption patterns, how we eat, what we eat, how we patronize what is produced locally, and how we take that pride that was instilled in us as the revolutionary children to purchase from local, to engage in local foods, etc. Then I think this is something that that I hear a lot. The education of the people in understanding that if we don't change our consumption patterns, no matter how we speak about of increasing agriculture and increasing food productivity, increasing agro-processing, etc. If we don't change our pattern and what we like and to consume, then we basically would be, as we say locally, spinning top in mud.
Dr. Tessa, I can't help but think when I hear you speak, as well as offer an assessment of the realities at hand, that Grenada is in good hands because you're there. And I feel like we're only scratching the surface with respect to the challenges of modernity at hand in the Caribbean, as well as in particular in Grenada, as well as in too a variety of different revolutionary possibilities and solutions that could be, as well as still can be offered by things like the New Jewel movement, as well as in even too agents of change like yourself, with all the knowledge and wisdom that you carry, as well as share with us when you offer your perspectives and insights. I think because of time. Oh, go ahead.
As you mentioned the word, sorry to cut, but you mentioned the word in terms of revolution, and I participated in a discourse sometime late last year, and one of the things that I mentioned is that we need a new revolution, but a new revolution not in terms of revolution by the guns or revolution by weapon, but revolution as in agriculture. So we need a new revolution in agriculture, as well as a revolution of our minds towards agriculture.
Here. I don't know if there's a more cogent and apt way to put it, Dr. Tessa. And I want to offer you my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for sharing a snapshot of Grenada's history, as well as the contemporary moment, as well as then too the wisdom that you have about the Caribbean as a region, as well as then too what's going on in Grenada. Before we let you go, however, we are going to run through a little segment we call Rad Knowledge Beyond the Pod.
Question number one. Although I think you probably dropped this one already. Question one is, what is your favorite quote? Who is it from and why?
Well, I think I might have mentioned a quote earlier on by Morris Bishop when he spoke about the right of freedom of expression. It can really only be relevant if people are not too hungry or too tired to be able to express themselves. And I like that quote. It came obviously from Maurice Bishop, and I like that quote because I think it speaks to so much, and it speaks a lot to, giving persons, ensuring that we have that freedom to be able to express ourselves, whilst at the same time um, alluding to the importance of ensuring food sovereignty, ensuring that, and it's from there that that's why I have such a passion for ensuring that the idea of food security, in the sense that if we are not hungry, if we are not too dependent, then we are free. There's that freedom to be able to express.
It's perfectly put, Dr. Tessa. But the next question is, what social movement should listeners become familiar with and why?
Well, our whole conversation was on that, the movement, the revolutionary period. So I think, from my perspective, this is something that I believe listeners should want to have a look at, that the new Jewel movement during that period, and what emanated from it, the lessons learned from it. And because I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from that movement, not just for us as Grenadians, but for the wider diaspora, because it speaks so much to what is happening globally, what is happening on a world scale, in, in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of the whole idea of um, steering away from the whole colonialism aspects and those sort of things. I think there's a lot to learn from that particular movement.
Our next question is, what book is a must read and why?
That's an easy pick for me because I want to take you a little bit to why that book for me. I first encountered that book when I was doing my master's in 2010. I was given an essay to write on the underdevelopment of Africa. And I came in contact with that book by Walter Rodney, I think, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I saw so much similarities in that book with the Caribbean, because many of the Caribbean countries were colonized by European countries, and we exchanged so many different hands from different European countries, and and aspects of this colonization, I think, contributed heavily to why we are where we are now, and that's for a whole different podcast. So I believe it's a must read, because even as we society has evolved and ideas have evolved over the decades from the time this book was penned, you still see we still see a lot within that book that is currently expressed today, that we see is happening within our whole Caribbean perspective, in terms of its similarities to what happened in African countries during the revolutionary period. The whole idea of us being producers to export, the plantation economy, etc. And I believe that there's a lot to learn from that book.
Very much so. Anti-imperialist revolutionaries striking back in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Dr. Tess, that's an incredible recommendation, as well as a key text to engage with. We're now going to pivot to question number 4. What film is a must-see and why?
I must say I'm not much of a person who looks too much at films, but in the few that I would have looked at, I would say one of those that struck me a lot was that film, Poetic Justice. Why? Because I saw in that film, in the midst of the struggles as a people, in the midst of what happened, what emerged was through tough times, that love for people, emanated still in the midst of struggle. So I think that's why I would recommend that film, because even if you're going through a lot, the whole idea of human nature and the whole idea of love can come from the midst of a struggle.
Dr. Tessa, did you say Poetic Justice? Is this the film from the early 90s?
Yes, from the early 90s. Yes.
Okay, and it's very much about, I mean, you mentioned it there, sort of the revolutionary potential of love, but also even creative expression and poetry.
Right. Well, it speaks a lot about the toughest of times during
Yeah.
in the hood, the younger persons and so. But in from that, the love story that emanated from it, it gave me that sort of hope that even when there's struggles, that you find, you could still find aspects that of things that or people that you love that can help you through those tough times.
Indeed. That's a great callback. We're going to go to question number 5, Johanna.
What song or musician is a must listen and why?
Well, girl, earlier on when we were speaking, I spoke to my love for reggae, my love for calypso. And aside from Bob Marley, I want to emphasize Black Stallion. And why so I hope your listeners would look at Black Stallion because he's a Caribbean artist, he's calypso, and calypso is not something that is too globally recognized because we don't see it on the award stage, etc. But I think if we go back and listen to Leroy Callis, the Black Stallion, and his repertoire, his songs, you see he did so much in terms of things like singing about Caribbean unity, um, singing things, looking at the brighter side, informing us that better days are coming, you know? And then what I love the themes that he uses, and it's not just Caribbean related because it's also on a global scale. He speaks to a lot of global issues. He sings about nation building, he sings about regional unity, etc. So, and I think he should be someone that should be worldly acclaimed, not just on a regional basis. And that's why I have I have him as one of my favorite artists aside from Bob Marley. I still need to mention Bob Marley.
Bob Marley makes a frequent appearance on the podcast this season in particular.
Yes.
Which is something we very much welcome. Okay, we're going to furiously be searching Calypso after this episode. I know listeners will be checking it out. And so we're going to end. We've got one more question for you, Dr. Tessa. Thanks for indulging here. What artist, poet, thinker, or even creative soul in general should listeners become familiar with and why?
Well, I think by now your listeners would be familiar with Maya Angelou. Um, I I I first her poem on Still I Rise. It meant a lot to me personally, and so that's why I see her as someone, a poet that persons should listen to and read some of her literary pieces, and not just in terms of her pieces, but her whole story of overcoming the social adversities, and these are things that we have a lot of still existing in society today. Her experiences as a child and as a woman, even in the whole activism period, the whole Black activism period, as well as her childhood experiences, etc. I think there's a lot to learn from her story, not just from her poetic pieces, but just from her biography. And that's why she's one of the artists that I often single out when I'm confronted with this question.
Dr. Tessa Berry, that is a wonderful and inspiring note to end on. On behalf of co-producers Adaeze and Johanna, I want to thank you for your time, as well as sharing a bit of the immense amount of wisdom that you have about Grenada as well as the region.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. I do hope that, I was able to enlighten as well as encourage for further research, for further um, delving into aspects and probably for a bit of interest in Grenada and the region.
Enlightening and provoking curiosity is definitely what you've accomplished today. Dr. Tessa, thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.